What's up, guys? It's your girl, Ryland. Thanks so much for tuning in to another video. I know it's so out of character for me to post so soon after my last video. Yesterday, I posted a video where I basically said, let's stop arguing about communism versus capitalism, and let's instead start centering our conversations about economic policy around the idea of a free market structure. Today, I am just going to give a very simple, brief overview of what a free market structure is and how it compares to America's current economic system. To give an official Google definition, a free market structure is a system in which the prices for goods and services are regulated by an open market of negotiations between a buyer and a seller, with no market coercion. That's important. So it's a little bit of a mouthful. Let me break it down into simpler terms. We all know the basics of supply and demand. A free market structure relies heavily on the laws of supply and demand, where a business owner has to balance how they'll price their product based on the resources that are available to them, as well as how much a consumer is even willing to pay for the product. Wait, so what is market coercion? Glad you asked. I'll get into that in a sec. First, I want to show you a simple example of a business operating under a free market versus our current one. I'm in real estate, so let's use the example of building a home. Let's say we have this guy named Bob the builder, if you will. Under a free market, Bob has the freedom to go out and use his skills to build a home and sell it at market price. So Bob does just that. He goes ahead and he builds a house, and he's able to sell it to a buyer that's totally willing to pay $200,000 for it. Bob just earned $200,000. Good for you, Bob. You're doing great. Most of us would say that's fair. I mean, Bob made this revenue as a result of his own labor and his own skills. What's to argue? But what we observe under our current system is a little bit different. While Bob technically could go out and do this, what we're most likely to see and observe in our current market is Bob being hired by a guy named Jared. Jared has something called capital, which is basically just a lot of money that he can use to invest in a team and the resources needed to start building homes. I gave it a quick Google, and the average builder makes about $35,000 a year. So let's say Jared hires Bob for $35,000 a year to build a house. Bob builds that same house as he did in the example before, and Jared, once it's complete, sells that same house for the same price, $200,000. After paying Bob his $35,000, Jared has now profited $165,000 after this transaction. Whether this is good or bad is subjective depending on who you talk to. At the end of the day, what matters is that Jared had the ability to do this, so he did. So, under a free market structure, Bob and Jared could totally still work together. Maybe Jared's specialized skill that he sells to the marketplace is that he's really good at finding opportunities to build and managing the process to ensure that it goes smoother and they hit deadline. But honestly, Jared would have a really hard time convincing Bob to only make $35,000 doing this project when Bob could just go off on his own without Jared and make that full $200K to himself. This is again where that law of supply and demand comes in. Supply and demand doesn't just apply to product, it applies to every single interaction we have in the marketplace, including employment. Bob would have to decide if and what Jared's oversight is worth to him for them to be able to work together on this deal. Likely meaning that Jared's cut of the revenue is probably much less than that $165K in the example that we talked about before. The reason is because Bob, under this system of a free market structure, owns his labor. You've probably come across the term means of production. That's what this is. Bob owns the means of production in his specific business. So why doesn't this happen in our current system? Why are builders only making $35,000? I mean, real estate is selling for way more than $200,000. So why are builders only making $35,000? That's where the concept of market coercion comes in. Or as I like to say, when the variables of supply and demand are manipulated. There's a ton of examples of market coercion, and they usually come from predatory business practices and corrupt government intervention. Market coercion is the reason that we all kind of universally agree that monopolies are bad. because a monopoly is essentially free to implement as much market coercion as they please to get their desired profit. They can raise prices as much as they want because the laws of supply and demand are no longer regulating their control over the market. This is why competition in a market is so important, because if one business starts to own too much of a given industry, the power and influence over the market all rests on one or few individuals. And this is a democracy, right? We need democracy. Let's look at Soviet Union Russia, for example. When Stalin came into power, he claimed to be a Leninist Marxist, which actually advocates for people like Bob to own their means of production. But instead, he actually took away everyone's freedom to enter the marketplace with a good and service. He collectivized all of Russia's biggest industries, like agriculture, forcing farmers to be stripped of the land that they previously worked on and relocated to work on these large farming compounds, where all profits, of course, funneled through Stalin. This is our greatest, best example of a monopoly, when one or very few people are profiting off of the labor of other people. Over time, Stalin's profit margins grew. Meanwhile, he was paying his workers and feeding them less and less. While Russia's infrastructure was crumbling, preventing the ability to import goods into different parts of Russia, including the Ukraine, Stalin was off networking and creating profitable trade deals with allying countries. As we know, the Soviet Union quickly descended into a forced famine where millions of people starved to death just because they couldn't get access to food. Even though Stalin was receiving unprecedented amounts of profit from the agriculture sector, Ukraine specifically lost a whopping 13% of their population to the forced famine. Kind of makes sense why they'd want to be independent from Russia just a few decades after this horrific tragedy took place. Other countries that didn't know about the forced famine were applauding Stalin for the growth in profits and the growth in their GDP, which calls into question whether or not a GDP is actually a good measurement of how healthy a country's economy is. See, when you monopolize a product, you don't just have full control over the product. You have full control over the workforce that specializes in producing that product. A monopoly can pay their employees virtually nothing and turn around and sell that same good for an exorbitant price. I think we can all agree that we want to get as far away from that as possible. Am I right? So what kind of market coercions do we see in America? In other words, what are the practices that prevent individuals from entering the workforce and making revenue off of their own specialized skills? You'll have to watch that in my next video because I have bummed you out enough for the day. Go outside, touch some grass, love you, and come back tomorrow where I will bum you out even more and get into the market coercion in the US economy. See you then, bye.